Hello, and welcome to the third Thursday at Hoover's. I'm Tom Schwartz, Director of the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you for joining us this evening. We have a very interesting program for you tonight entitled Hoover and Criminal Justice Reform. As a reminder, we'll take your questions at the end of the presentation. You can enter them at any time by using the Q&A feature in the Zoom window. You can even vote for someone else's question to move it higher in the queue. We are also recording this program so you can replay it at any time or share it with friends and family. We'll send you a link to the recording tomorrow. As I mentioned before, tonight's program is called Hoover and Criminal Justice Reform. Our speaker is Dr. James Calder, a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. He's been on the faculty there since 1979, teaching and publishing first as a member of the Department of Criminal Justice, and then in the departments of political science and geography. In recent years, his teaching in political science has included topics in global affairs, homeland security, the intelligence community, and world affairs, federal justice policymaking, and politics and film. His articles and books have focused mainly on security matters, political leaders, and crime control policies, including studies of American presidents and their roles in directing federal actions against organized crime. Good evening, Dr. Calder. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tom, for that introduction. I must make one correction. It's the University of Texas at San Antonio. We're the folks with only 35 or 36,000 students. They have 53,000 students. So, but in any event, here we are. And I'm so happy to be here to share a few reflections on a topic that for many people is unfamiliar. And I've spent as much time perhaps as you, Tom, in informing people that Herbert Hoover did have a hand in federal criminal justice reforms. Well, the quest for origins began back in my doctoral work out in California, having been trained at two levels in theoretical criminology and then on to criminal justice in California. And then in political science at the doctoral level, I was very much interested in looking at how presidents approached crime control policy. How did they develop their thinking? What kinds of influences did they have along the way to write and say the kinds of things that they did about crime in America and so on? Well, I was looking at JFK and LBJ and Richard Nixon at the time and really didn't give any attention to much that came before. I didn't look at Eisenhower, I didn't look at Roosevelt or Truman, I didn't look at Roosevelt, and I certainly didn't look at Herbert Hoover. But later on, I discovered there was kind of a scant literature in the area of presidents and crime control policy. That is to say, when I was looking, for example, in criminology, I hardly found any mention of history of criminal justice system reforms, even though when I was studying the subject, there was so much interest in how we got into many of the problems that we were, but history sort of began with JFK rather than other presidents before him. And at the same time, looking at the political science literature, I didn't find very much at all. Tom Cronin out in California was doing a little work on presidents and crime control, but it was rather superficial, respectfully submitted. He really didn't dig deeply into any of the records to formulate his views, which were useful at the time. So it was my thinking that I could launch into more of a historical work to find the origins. And hence I wound up at the Hoover Presidential Library, and I think it was 1981. And there I met George Nash, who later on wrote the preface to my book in 1993. George is a good friend. Then I moved to congressional records, of course, and did all the normal historical research. I'm not a trained historian in the same way Tom is, but I'm a political science person who grew up in Washington, D.C., and there was no way around historical research. Other libraries, but the fun part was in suing the Internal Revenue Service for the Al Capone records. And of course, the IRS was not very happy about that, in as much as they didn't want to give away tax records. The point is that I was not interested in the tax records. The man never paid any taxes, so I really didn't care. But I litigated and litigated for 3 years and eventually lost 2-1 in the United States Court of Appeals, Fifth Circuit in New Orleans. So that's a little bit of the background of how I got into this Hoover investigation that came along later after the JFK and LBJ and Nixon period. Here we are looking back, and I guess I have about 3 points of background. I'm sorry, 2 additional points about background that ought to be part of the lead up to Hoover's presidency and the work he did in crime control policy. And that is to look at the 1920s as an extraordinarily important period for studying a whole range of social problems that had come along and had been evolving for a number of decades after the Civil War. For heaven's sakes, we had huge population growth, lots of westward movement, urbanization, health and food problems, and of course, crime, which in the 1920s was virtually on the front page of every newspaper every day. Criminology as a study area comes along as a discipline, but a sub-discipline mainly to sociology. But there were other disciplines around evolving very rapidly in the 1920s. Demography and statistics, of course. Statistics comes out of the late 19th century, but you've got psychology, psychiatry, even social work comes along in the early 1920s as an adjunct to sociology. The professions, the so-called professions of criminal justice, police agencies, law and court administration, jails and prisons, were massive challenges for the organizations managing them. But there was a heck of a lot of leadership going on in each of these institutions. And of course, combining the professional areas, we would call them professional areas today, with the advances of the social and behavioral sciences, you get this nice mix of willingness to study the laboratories for justice administration, policing, courts, and jails and prisons, and so on. In addition, you've got the scientific management movement, Frederick Taylor and that whole bunch, H.L. Gant, who were developing the classical management theories about how to run major organizations, scientific management, and all the problems that were very, very commonplace in those years. We had alcoholism, we had drug addiction, we had food quality issues, mental health, child labor, we had labor violence. All of that was there in the background mix of social change. Well, what's interesting about all of this to me, and that was my sort of awakening about all of this in the background, was that Hoover's life parallels all of this. While he's not a sociologist, he's a mining engineer. He's a humanitarian. He becomes a politician later on. But he's growing up in so many different ways. But he's aware of these various problems and circumstances of social change. So let's take Herbert Hoover into the 1920s and in the lead up to his presidency. I call it the pre-presidency interests that he had in justice matters. Hoover became familiar with justice issues in some interesting ways through his mining engineering and through the work on the Belgian relief program and working with Calvin Coolidge as Secretary of Commerce. So I think those 5 bulleted items there kind of reflect the experiential side of his growing up in the crime and justice arena. He was frustrated by the systemic corruption in China during his mining exercises or enterprises. He's concerned about his own partners and friends, or associates, I should say, in business activities, bothered by the bureaucratic inertia during the Belgian refugee circumstance. He's familiar with monopolistic cartels, and he forms the very strong opinion that monopolistic cartels are not good for capitalist systems and violated economic interests. And then, of course, he's advising Calvin Coolidge concerning the massive fraud in Teapot Dome. Now, these are not original discoveries by me. These are the secondary source authors who deeply investigated Hoover's background in these years. I simply mined all those and put them together to say, hey, this was a bit of his education, experiential education. But then you kind of have to consider the list here of just a small list of the people he met and knew quite closely. Larry Ritchie, and Larry Ritchie later becomes a special assistant to Hoover for a number of years, even in the post-presidency. Had been in Treasury. Hoover retains him as an investigator for the Belgian relief program because Hoover suspected that there was waste, fraud, and abuse in the middle of that at some point. He knows J. Edgar Hoover, who later becomes a Bureau of Investigation director on Hoover's recommendation to Harlan Stone when Harlan Stone was in the Justice Department. William Mitchell, Sanford Bates, who Mitchell becomes his Attorney General. Sanford Bates is former commissioner of corrections in Massachusetts, a politician in his own right in the House and Senate in that state, and worked in New Jersey as well. George Wickersham, he knows as former Attorney General. He meets Andrew Mellon, knows Mellon very well. They become very close friends. And last but not least is Mabel Walker Willebrandt, who was head of the Prohibition and Prisons Department. Poor lady had quite a burden there throughout that period of time because the overcrowding of prisons was beyond the pale. I mean, it was just an extraordinary negative situation in federal prison growth. Facilities weren't there. There was a lot of violence. They were overcrowded, idle prisoners, and so on. Mabel Walker Willebrandt goes to work for Hoover. Later, sadly for her anyway, Hoover had to fire her, excuse me, for certain comments that she had made that were not very helpful during the campaign of 1928 in association with religion, the sort of religious dimension that came out, Al Smith being Catholic and pro-prohibition and anti-prohibition, and Mabel Walker Willebrandt the other side of the aisle. So Hoover couldn't allow that to go on, so he had to fire Mabel. But they remained lifelong friends. There's interesting correspondence between the two thereafter. Hoover, of course, reaches the White House March the 4th of 1929. His inaugural address is very, very interesting. I was struck by this in just reading it. It was new to me, commonplace to lots of other people, but his inaugural address, as you know, was delivered before 50,000 people standing with umbrellas in a nasty cold rain. And he places criminal justice reforms as the first substantive issue in the inaugural address. So I challenge anyone to find another inaugural address for any of the presidents in which crime and criminal justice reforms are the first substantive issue. It just doesn't happen. You don't want to start the inaugural address with something like that. Well, of course, the crime and criminal justice reforms were very much in the news, and Hoover was determined to deal with these things, and they are very much tied to the prohibition issue. In fact, so much so that even to this day, there are folks who even remember that there was a prohibition. You have to explain this to our students these days. What was prohibition? And we usually say, well, you know what, legalization of marijuana is all about. Oh yeah, we understand that. Well, think about prohibition and the same kinds of dynamics and tensions that exist between those who want to decriminalize certain drugs and those who say absolutely not. So in any event, Hoover is a person who is a candidate who does not want to simply, and president now, simply link law enforcement, criminal justice reforms to prohibition. He wants to think about the whole problem of law enforcement. He wants to consider the federal machinery of justice in its entirety. He wants to focus attention on the reduction of crime. It's not just an exercise in policing, which was so much favored by many who were staunchly prohibitionists. We just want to go out and police our way into having people give up alcohol. And for heaven's sakes, it's always been my view, and I share this with students frequently. This is an alcohol consuming nation, always has been. One of my favorite reflections, taking a sociology course as a young freshman in a college in the Washington, D.C. area, was George Washington's liquor bill. It was a piece of sociological literature. Of course, the purpose of the professor at that time was to awaken freshmen to the idea that there is a real world out there. Alcohol is part of it and has always been since George Washington's time. He never suggested that George Washington was an alcoholic by any stretch, but just the alcohol bill, the amount of alcohol that was served, basically wine and some form of beer. So the ultimate objective here is to reduce crime. Now, he in a press conference in April of 29, he brings in Harlan Fiske Stone to the justice into his justice system plans for selecting the very best. Stone had his own high credibility in the day, as many other infamous and well-respected justices, Cardozo and Roscoe Pound and others who Hoover knew quite well, and knew them from their various pieces of research in justice administration and justice studies. Well, then, of course, May 20th, I mean, here's the President of the United States demonstrating that this business of studying scientifically the matter of criminal justice reforms appears at the first meeting of the Law Enforcement Commission, follows that particular matter, a few remarks to the commission, sort of setting out his ideals, his expectations, but not dictating them to the commission. I thought that was rather interesting. Here's a president of the United States meeting with the commission itself. Now, later presidents have done this as well, not all. Lyndon Johnson sat down with his own commission. Richard Nixon had many communications over his interest in organized crime, as did Ronald Reagan later on in organized crime, and had many meetings directly with the respective commissions during their administrations. So you can see the kind of persistence that Hoover had in bringing this subject to the public early in his administration. And frankly, it was a darn good thing that he did, because 1929 was his best year in terms of dealing with these kinds of problems, and especially domestic issues tied to improvements that could be made if we'd only study them and focus on the repairs that could be made. He brings up criminal justice in his State of the Union in early December 1929, and in fact, he has a rather lengthy description of federal prison objectives, modifications to them, to the federal prisons, and he addresses affirmatively the prohibition issue again. What needed to be done was in terms of enforcing the law, but at the same time improving the quality of justice in all respects. He brings up criminal justice once again a year later, but recall that, you know, the economic crash occurred in late October of 1929. So 1930 is becoming a problematic year for going too deeply into these areas. But in addition, he's of course preoccupied with lots and lots of economic matters in 1930. But in 1930, he brings up one component of the Wickersham Commission studies, which had not been completed at this point, and that is the matter of deportation of illegal aliens, which, as you know, has come back in the discussions of late. What do we do about people who come into the country illegally? Well, Hoover wanted to make it clear, and this was clear from the Wickersham Commission report, that that deportation is not something that is directly tied to illegal alien entry into the country. Yes, you may have some folks who commit crimes if they come into the country illegally, but Hoover was quite clear in his thinking that that was not his objective. He wanted the Congress to go to work on an immigration bill in those days. Sound familiar? We're dealing with that issue today, but he didn't think of illegal aliens as people in the center of crime causation. Okay, well, let's take a look at the Wickersham Commission. You've got, 11, 12 lawyers and judges, people of high respect, beginning with George Wickersham and Anderson, Baker, and Grubb, and Kenyon, and Lamont, and from New Orleans, and Frank Lausch, very prominent in Chicago Crime Commission, McIntosh, McCormick, and of course the scholar in the bunch, Roscoe Pound. One woman represented, that's Ada Comstock, who is president of Radcliffe College and a sociologist by her training. And there's an interesting picture I grabbed for this presentation. You'll notice the hats, of course, including Ada Comstock is wearing hers. The guys in the back don't have any on. I'm kind of surprised because it was sort of a gloomy day. But here we are, and there's Herbert Hoover prominently smiling in the center with George Wickersham next to him. The Wickersham Commission does a great deal of work in a 2-year period. They were funded for $500,000. The amount of money became contentious after a while in Congress. Frankly, there were members in the Senate who wanted, and in the House as well, who wanted to beat up on Herbert Hoover over the what they considered to be the sort of weak approaches to the enforcement of prohibition. The prohibitionists wanted to sort of use the funding as a lever to get the Wickersham Commission to definitely affirm the prohibition, which was not Herbert Hoover's thinking. What Herbert Hoover wanted was a study of prohibition to the extent that prohibition had aided the deterioration of the system of criminal justice, federal criminal justice. But at the same time, it was to be maintained as a legal condition. He always upheld the idea that the Constitution was amended, the 18th Amendment, and that the system was there to enforce the law. That was his primary concern. So he wanted a balanced study. Ultimately, there were 14 reports, 14 volumes produced, quite a challenging task in a 2-year period, but they worked very hard, brought in lots and lots of consultants, all top people from across the country, the best universities, the very best examples of professional work in policing, courts, and prison and jail management, probation and parole, lots and lots of consultants. They held closed door sessions, they had open speeches. The consultants went off and did their work. One of the most distinguished people in law enforcement, aside from Arthur Woods, was August Vollmer, who was chief of police in Berkeley, California. So Hoover was intent upon bringing in the very best. Of course, George Wickersham went out and found the people and recommended them to the president. Significant controversies go back and forth within the commission. Some knockdown, drag out fights, you might say, verbal, of course. But you'll notice that the first 2 volumes, these are numbered in order. The first 2 volumes are devoted to both law enforcement and just the circumstances of prohibition, its creation and its meaning and all of that. Interesting volumes. Most of the time, these 2 reports are sort of dismissed because I think people understand that prohibition was sustained until December of 1933. But there are other very interesting reports. Criminal statistics. We had no criminal statistical system. A big fight took place between J. Edgar Hoover, Bureau of Investigation head, and Sam Bass Warner, a scholar. Warner wanted only prosecutorial and conviction data to be counted for crime statistics. Hoover wanted police statistics. Hoover won. We have the uniform crime reports beginning in 1929 and all the way down to the present. Prosecution had to do with the quality of the individuals serving in the federal system. Deportation laws needed to be changed. The commission promoted that idea. How to do that, another problem. Child offenders. This is the first examination of child offenders in federal justice. The federal courts, not just their descriptions, but their need for more resources as criminal procedure needed to change in order to accommodate largely the prohibition cases. When you think about it, the numbers of people arrested, tried, and convicted on prohibition violations was huge, and consequently flooding the courts, federal, state, and local levels, and flooding the local jails, and flooding the federal system. What's interesting about the federal system right about this time is the largest single group in federal prisons was not prohibition people, but narcotics violators. We had, we'll talk about that here in a minute, but narcotics, I was struck by that. But prohibition violators were there too in fairly substantial numbers. There were only 3, I'll talk about that later, but there are only 3 major federal prisons at that time. Crime amongst the foreign-born was a sort of interesting, strange area. It's sort of the foundation of looking into illegal offenders coming into this country and then becoming gangsters. There's even reflection by Hoover on the term organized crime, which many people today say, oh, no, that originated in the studies of the of the Kefauver committee later on. Lawlessness in law enforcement, my goodness, police use of force, which is a subject today. This was the first major study of that phenomenon, which you might think was covered in the 14th volume Police, but they separated the two issues: the corruption in police agencies, the corruption in local governments tied to police departments, and so on. A very interesting volume here, and a really cutting edge piece was something known as The Cost of Crime. I have the volume here, which I bought a few years later. You can see it's quite a hefty volume. It's 650 or 60 pages in length. Hoover's interest was in, and the commission's interest therefrom, was to study how the private sector played a role in, from citizens to businesses to corporations, in the matter of controlling crime, and including the private police. We call them private security today. Some of them, thousands of them, are what you call rent-a-cops, and huge industry internationally. But Hoover and Wickersham wanted to study the private sector's involvement, and ultimately what all of this was costing the American taxpayer at three levels: federal, state, and local. Administration of justice is expensive. It has infrastructure, it has human labor, it has all of the conflicts and specializations that are required to address various individual problems, victim issues, and so forth. And then, of course, a volume on causes of crime. They had to put this in there largely because the theories of criminal causation were developing very rapidly, with Thorsten Selin and others leading the way mainly in sociology. So they thought they better put it in here. I'm kind of surprised, because today we would kind of put that up front. Why are we here? Well, crime is the problem. Well, what are its causes? And last but not least was a straightforward analysis of police organizations. There was a special case known as the Mooney Billings case, which was, the press called it a suppressed report, but in essence, it was all about a major disagreement within the commission as to whether or not special cases, such as the Mooney Billings bombing case of 1916, would be incorporated in the broader context of these kinds of studies. Eventually, the study was found. It was actually lost for a few weeks, and then it was suddenly found and eventually published. You can find it. You can find it online. In fact, the Mooney Billings case. Cops and courts, court procedures. I'll speed this along a little bit here in the interest of time, but prohibition, of course, has a negative impact on all kinds of enforcement practices, policing as well as courts. It produces a massive amount of corruption in the legal system. Hoover's idea, frankly, as he states here, I've taken sections out of it in order, however, prohibition was not to be discussed in his view in terms of just displays of violence, shoot 'em ups and displays of force by government to get people to stop drinking or dealing in it or making it or what have you. His idea was that there was a need to apply steady pressure to weed out, and this is interesting, he uses the term incapable and negligent officials. I love that, because here's a president of the United States accusing the justice system of having a massive number of incapable and negligent officials. Well, I think that's pretty clear. And it was no great surprise to lots of people, particularly citizens who had to deal with the system. But again, he's reforming the federal system. He has no authority to reform only to lead or to use as models the federal system for state systems. And of course, to maintain rigid scrutiny over records and attitudes. Well, there's your systematic Herbert Hoover. Keep the records, build the data. Two very important leaders in the field. There are many, but a couple of models that he, shall we say, trotted out frequently. J. Edgar Hoover, personal friend of Herbert Hoover for many, many years, and Harry Anslinger. He had Harry Anslinger appointed as director of Federal Bureau of Narcotics. When you talk to people today, they think the narcotics problem in America, or many do, the narcotics problem began in, say, those liberal 1960s. Well, say it ain't so. It wasn't so. There was a rather substantial opium problem in the United States, and how the stuff was getting into the country. Hoover's view, Herbert Hoover's view was, we have to look beyond just enforcement. We have to look at why people are using drugs and how so much of it is entering the United States on the basis of a demand. We have the same problem today, only it's worse. We as a society, and this is a personal view, we as a society don't like to blame ourselves for being the customers of the massive drug problem. We'd rather point fingers at the suppliers. The old argument between supply and demand. So Hoover and others want to clean out the ineffective and corrupt prosecutors and judges. They want to make procedural inefficiencies go away, and essentially to reduce the dockets in the courtroom in terms of volume and in terms of the quality of justice. Hoover's very strongly stated view on many occasions is you can't have an inefficient and corrupt system of justice to convince people that they should be adhering to the law. And his idea of law enforcement was subscription to law, following the law. His regular preachment, the cops and the courts. And then, of course, we have the interesting Al Capone case. I'll try to brief this quickly. Actually, the case started in 1928 under Calvin Coolidge, but not so much Calvin Coolidge's interest, but it was more Charles Dawes, vice president, and Mabel Walker Wilbrand, Prohibition head in Department of Justice. That all started, but they had extreme difficulty in finding Al Capone in the middle of conspiracies in the alcohol arena. As you can appreciate, alcohol is a nasty business, just in terms of its logistics. It's dirty stuff, meaning it's water and hops and all of that. And you got to have a big factory, and you've got to have to make any money. You've got to have these trucks coming and going in one door and out the other. You've got to hire. It's very labor intensive, so it has a lot of profile to it. But at the same time, all of that was in the interest of serving the bars and the individuals their alcohol. Know clearly that the Volstead Act, which is the enforcement side of the 18th Amendment, is all about manufacturing, sale, and distribution. It is not about possession. You could have and consume all the alcohol you could get your hands on, but it wasn't illegal to do so. It was illegal to make it, sell it, transport it, and so on. So anyway, so it's a difficult problem to find the gangsters in the middle of these alcohol conspiracies. Hoover orders William Mitchell, Attorney General, to take over the Capone case early on. But at the same time, that then led to J. Edgar Hoover, and J. Edgar Hoover could only go after a contempt of court case, which became very difficult to find evidence on Capone. Hoover was surveilling Capone in Florida, his gambling activities. He was not sick on the days that he claimed to be sick and so on. So all of that was brewing, but it was kind of a very weak case. Andrew Mellon, of course, was then charged and through the IRS and its intelligence function to go after Capone because they thought that they could get him on tax evasion for 3 years, only 3 years. When you think about it, many people give Al Capone a lot of credit for being this brilliant gangster, but frankly, I've never thought of him that way. I've always thought of him as kind of stupid, to the extent that all he had to do to escape prosecution was pay his taxes for 3 years. And if you know anything about the taxation in the federal taxation, it was 1% of adjusted gross income, 1%. Okay, so you lie about your income and you get your adjusted gross income way down, and then you pay 1%. He could certainly afford that, but he and his lawyers stubbornly succumb to going in the direction of sort of fighting the government. Sound familiar? So the intensive investigations go along. They are very complex. Law enforcement had a difficult time developing evidence and getting people willing to testify. Big problem. Eventually, there's a showdown in the courtroom, and frankly, the government committed a near fatal mistake along the way. I won't go into that, but Capone is ultimately convicted, given a 10-year federal pen sentence, and of Cook County Jail for 1 year. He didn't serve out all of that time. He was sick with syphilis in the late 1930s, and their decision was made, got worse and worse. The decision was made to let him out and let him go back to Florida and do some fishing. Some of you may have seen pictures of Al Capone in those years. He was completely out of it. His brain was pretty much fried during that period of time. Still had a lot of power, though, and influence. He's in Atlanta Penitentiary beginning in May of 1932 as prisoner 40866, a number that was somewhat difficult to find, but eventually I found it. It's not listed in some of the documents in the federal prison system. Sanford Bates became a very good friend of Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover had to rely on him as a leading corrections prison management official with lots and lots of experience, but more importantly, some really great ideas for dealing with the prison deterioration that was occurring all over the country and had for decades. In the summer of 1929, there were 6 major prison riots, and these became front page stories. What's going on? The brutality of prisons. In one prison, 13 people died and many were injured. Today, that wouldn't mean very much because our prisons are so much larger. But in those times, 13 people to die in a prison riot, and people were dying in other prison riots. And it's not that there's a political coalition to support prisoners. It's the idea that here the notions of how to improve prison conditions are coming along. There are ideas about reformation or rehabilitation that are becoming increasingly popular, how to change behavior. And I think we have to explain that to people today. 99.9% of all the prisoners in prison today, hundreds of thousands of them. We have the largest prison population in the world, likewise in those years, but a lot of prohibition cases. That high percentage of people is coming out of prison at some point. And so it's important to try to reform or change. Reform is not a word that's used very often, but rehabilitate, change lives, change thinking, and so on within the prison context. Well, Hoover asked Bates on the interview when he suggests, he's considering people for the position as director of Bureau of Prisons. He asked Bates, which is better, to reform the 90,000 or teach the 122 million people, the population of the United States, the adult population? I guess it was the adult population. But in any event, Bates had an interesting answer. Mr. President, why not do both? We can do both. We have the thinking, we have the plans. We can do that and help blend these people back into society with some meaningful occupation. That's been the goal all along, of course. Whether or not it happens is, complex. But at least we can eliminate the abuse, the unprofessional conduct. We can attack overcrowding and idleness by expanding the prison population. Hoover had to go forthrightly to the Congress to get money. Now, mind you, this is 1930, 31, and 32, in which Congress is passing legislation to build prisons to house people who are violating the laws in rather substantial ways. Federal legislation, of course, is expanding the amount of the number of prisoners going to federal prison, but not greatly. He also diversifies the institutions. This was Bates's idea. He said, look, if you want to look toward reform, you're going to have to use families to do that. So if you have a prisoner in prison in Atlanta Penitentiary for some serious matter, and the family lives in New Mexico, how are they going to visit and be part of the changes in the behavior of, or contribute to the changes of behavior of the prisoner once they get out? So that was the thinking. Let's diversify the system and put some federal jails around in different places across the country. And that was actually accomplished and is in place today. Paroles and pardons are also very much in that mix of consideration for changes. I want to mention there are some what you might call sidebar cases, very important cases that come to the foreground. Some of them Hoover takes encounters some grief for not dealing with him in the way the popular media thought that he should. Lynchings, of course, bothered Herbert Hoover greatly. That's a whole story in and of itself. But frankly, Herbert Hoover didn't, as president of the United States, didn't have any authority to mix in that particular problem. The accusation was and remains that he didn't do enough verbally to lead what later became a kind of civil rights movement to counteract these things. Horrible situations, mainly in southern states, but they did occur in northern states as well, less so. There was a rape and murder case in Hawaii that Hoover, although he knew the people, the family involved, the Massey and Ferguson families, he didn't want to get involved in that. He didn't have any authority to do so. There were pardons cases that came out of Teapot Dome. Teapot Dome bothered Herbert Hoover for a long time, but keep in mind, this is 1929, 30, 31, and 32, when the folks in Teapot Dome are coming up for prospective pardons or various appeals to the president. Lindbergh kidnapping case, I think we're familiar with, 1932. The kidnapping law was not in place at the time. J. Edgar Hoover had no original jurisdictional authority to intervene in that. However, Herbert Hoover and J. Edgar Hoover worked together to say, hey, J. Edgar, go over there and help Schwarzkopf deal with the situation, who was police commissioner or state commissioner of police in New Jersey. Go over there and help them out. And the Bureau of Investigation was helpful in that case, but behind the scenes. Bonus March disaster, I think we know about that. Herbert Hoover took a lot of grief for that one. That's the matter of who shot first, who used the truncheon first. Was it General MacArthur in following, or was it Herbert Hoover's instruction that started the whole thing? Frankly, I point fingers more at General MacArthur on that one than Herbert Hoover by a long stretch. So I think what the point is here is that Herbert Hoover stuck pretty much to his limited authority within his constitutional and statutory bounds. He was not the kind of person or official who would step out of those bounds, and we see that consistently in these cases. Okay, a couple of more to sort of give us some overview. You know, what are the accomplishments? I think Wickersham was a groundbreaking piece of work done by lots and lots of very dedicated people who were brought in to study crime, to study the system, and to produce 14 volumes that could then later be used as guideposts and guidelines for state and local justice systems. Hoover's idea was not to use Wickersham to say, you states need to do this, that, or the other, not by a long stretch. It was to set the tone for how states and localities could follow. Federal justice systems come into view very clearly, expanded and improved enforcement and prosecution functions, particularly in the Fed, but again, models for the states. Prosecution of gangsters. It didn't start with Capone. There were other cases of prominent people. Even Tom Mix, the famous cowboy actor, was prosecuted for tax evasion in the Coolidge administration. So there were prominent people who were being held accountable for violation of the tax laws, which was one of the primary authorities for going after gangsters. But the prosecution of Al Capone was indeed a threshold moment. Hoover even said so in a quick note. He doesn't refer to Capone directly. A quick note on a memo. I can't remember to whom it was addressed. Maybe to Mitchell, saying, "Well, it was to the prosecutor in Chicago who won the case, and to the judge, maybe we can go after those New York people." So, you know, it leads you to think that Herbert Hoover is thinking about a grander scheme for going after the major gangsters. And it also reinforces the idea that organized crime was indeed pulling itself together in ways that we know about today that a lot of people didn't know about. The center of attention for them was in the New York realm, but organized crime was springing up all over the country in major urban areas. Federal correctional institutions are greatly improved and expanded. Hoover sustained his own control on the exercise of executive authority, as we mentioned, on special cases. And it's interesting that in his very last speech, Hoover appeared for the cornerstone laying on February 23rd of 1933 to declare his sort of final thoughts, a sort of summation of where justice administration should be. And these are some of the words in that speech. Again, laying the cornerstone of the Justice Department building. It's behind him there, huge stone. I've visited it and taken pictures of it. It's kind of interesting that all these years later, 1933. So how many years is that? That's what, 90 years ago. Conscious and reasoning of people can sustain justice. Men and women dedicated to the noblest pursuits of the human mind, spirit, and preservation majesty of law. This was a major principle for him, as we indicated. Law is the foundation of organized society, and public officials and equipment are indispensable. There you have the sort of bottom line on his expectations of improvements and reformation of the federal justice system. I think that kind of wraps it up. I know it was very fast paced. There's a lot to cover, and there's much more detail that goes along with this. Apologize for if we're having to rush so much, but could we entertain maybe some questions if there are any?
Okay, we do. Someone writes, Capone had every major elected official in Illinois on his payroll: Chicago mayor, police chief, governor, and judges. Didn't a group of leading Chicago business leaders plead with Hoover to do something?
Yes, they did, and Hoover was very clever in using his friendships with the press, with press people. And the investigative functions, of course, got into the details of that. There was a very secretive person within one of the newspapers there. I forget which one. It's in my book, but who remained anonymous. So you had press people who were helping out, and you had business community people doing the same sort of assistance, but behind the scenes, because obviously it's a very dangerous environment for anyone to sort of volunteer, go get Capone, Mr. and Mrs. Corporate Executive.
Yeah. Another question asks, were Herbert Hoover's Supreme Court appointments based on considerations in supporting his reforms, or simply merit and American Bar Association recommendations?
I didn't really look into that deeply. I know many of them who were nominated. He had I don't want to run away from your question, but he had an astounding record of appointments to all levels of the court, from federal district courts to appellate courts to the Supreme Court. When you think about Felix Frankfurter, Cardoza, and Harlan Stone and others, he was extraordinarily interested in merit. And each of those three, aside from others who were there, established profound records of scholarly, advanced thinking about how the law should move forward on the court. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think he was looking at merit.
Yeah. I know that Harlan Stone was even part of the Hoover Ball cabinet. He was a regular participant in
the medicine ball.
The medicine ball, yeah, in the every morning.
I don't know how long that lasted, however. I just wonder. Okay, it was great for photography, but I don't know.
Well, I mean, the White House physician wanted Hoover to exercise, and he didn't like it.
Right.
But he had been with Hoover on the Goodwill tour as president-elect and saw that he enjoyed the sailors playing medicine ball. And being about 5'10" and 210 pounds when he took the oath of office, when he left, he was down to 175.
Really? I didn't know that.
So yeah, the medicine ball helped.
But the people who were receiving the medicine ball when he was tossing it, and I understand he was rather aggressive in his tossing. Am I right about that? But he played ball. But the point is, his assistants are saying, "Oh gosh, we've got to do this today."
So one final question. Why was Calvin Coolidge uninterested in tackling organized crime and prison reforms? And then what was the New Deal's record on these things?
Well, to me, I haven't studied Coolidge very closely. I did look at his administration. He established a commission as well in 1924 to investigate criminal justice matters, but it was a weekly assembled private commission. When I say he orchestrated it, he was involved in creating that, and that commission did nothing. They had no reports, they had no consultants, and so on. But anyway, he really didn't have, in my view, any agenda, any policy there, and who knows? I mean, Calvin Coolidge is a pretty smart guy, but at the same time, prohibition was such a dirty business, particularly at that time. Not very politically appealing to, the office of the president. Now, as for later, what was the other part of the Coolidge part?
Prison reforms.
Oh, prison reform. Coolidge was not oriented that way. He really didn't. He delegated that. He did, he didn't concern himself with prisons. I can't find any evidence of that. But as to follow-on years, Franklin Roosevelt actually was run out of the Justice Department. Franklin Roosevelt did a lot with crime control measures, but a lot of it was done by Cummings. Cummings' focus was largely on organized crime. Organized crime in general. They had the 1934, and this really takes off from Hoover. I mean, it takes off from Wickersham to the extent that the gathering of about 500 scholars, 500, including police officials mainly, who got together to talk about criminal justice problems, but mainly policing problems. Mainly, there were others. Policing problems was a takeoff of Wickersham, but it formulated in a different way. It's fundamentally a conference of 500 people to come together to help states think about the various issues that needed to be pushed in the agenda of reforming state and local levels. Franklin Roosevelt took a lot of those leads from the Hoover administration, but he did that in other areas as well in the early years.
Yeah.
And then there's this ongoing interest in federal justice throughout the 1930s. But Franklin Roosevelt is dealing with so many other things in the Depression.
Well, that's all the time we have for now. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. James Calder from the University of Texas at San Antonio, for sharing his research on criminal justice reform. As a reminder, this program will be placed on the Hoover Presidential Foundation's website archive for you to enjoy and share at any time. Remember, the Presidential Library, along with the National Historic Site, is now open 7 days a week from 9 to 5. Please join us next month for encore presentation of Lou Henry Hoover's White House Years by author Annette Dunlap. Originally airing at this time last year, this popular episode looks at areas near and dear to Lou Hoover's heart: women's opportunities, the arts, and private philanthropy. Registration is open on the Foundation's website or through your favorite library. Remember to visit the Exquisite Miniatures exhibit, now open through September 24th. These tiny paintings have been hand-painted in such fine detail, you'll want to borrow a magnifying glass to get a good close-up view of each one. The Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is ready to assist you with your membership needs or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus and museum renovation. You can learn more about that and even show your support at timelessvaluescampaign.org. There's still time for last-minute gifts to qualify for the 25% Hoover State Tax Credit. On behalf of all of us at the Hoover campus and the participating public libraries, we thank you for joining us and look forward to your next visit to the Hoover campus.